It's Mrs. Horseman, and today I want to talk a little bit more about cell respiration, specifically the difference between anaerobic and aerobic respiration. Last time we had talked about mostly aerobic respiration, and we talked about the different phases or the different stages, and then we also talked about how much energy was created. So today I want to focus on two things. I want to focus on the relationship between photosynthesis and cell respiration, because now you know enough that we're going to be able to compare and contrast those two. I also want to spend a little bit of time so that you understand the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So let's get started with this. If you see in this picture, we have a diagram that's showing photosynthesis and the respiration cycle. And if you look, we have light coming in to this chloroplast. So this is representing photosynthesis. We have light coming in, we also have water and carbon dioxide. If you think about it and you think about what plants need, they need light, they need water, and they need air, okay? So those are the things that are going into the chloroplast. And because of that, with this reaction, they're going to make glucose, and they're also going to make oxygen. Whoops, sorry. If you think about what we need as humans, what we need to have to survive, we need oxygen and we need food. That food's going to provide us our energy, and that energy comes from glucose. So you see here we have oxygen and glucose going into the mitochondria. Coming out of the mitochondria, we have chemical energy, and then we also have carbon dioxide and water. So from this diagram, what I really want you to understand is that the products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water, become the reactants of chloroplast. And then the reactants of photosynthesis. And then the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are going to become the reactants for cellular respiration. I also want to remind you, because this is a common misconception, that plants do photosynthesis. Okay, they are the only eukaryotic organisms, algae and plants, that are able to do that process. However, all eukaryotes are able to carry out cellular respiration the way that we've talked about it, because all eukaryotes have mitochondria in them. So even plants are carrying out cellular respiration. They also carry out photosynthesis. We only can do cell respiration, which is why we have to eat. Just to make sure we're clear on that. Okay, so the last time we had talked, like I said, I showed you the different steps of cell respiration, and then we counted up the ATP. So let's just review that really quickly. Glycolysis is the first step. That's where the glucose is split in half, and we make 2 ATP. But there's still a lot left. So the rest of the molecules that are left over go into the Krebs cycle. It's finished being broken down, and we make 2 more ATP. There's still a lot more energy left in the electron carriers, so they're going to go to the electron transport chain, drop off the electrons, and that's going to power the production of 34 more ATP. So this is where the cell gets the most bang for its buck. So for one glucose molecule, we're getting 34 ATP in the electron transport chain, plus 2 in the Krebs cycle, plus 2 in glycolysis, so we get about 36 to 38 ATP for every one glucose molecule. That's a lot. In comparison, though, we're going to talk about a process today that doesn't make very much energy, but it still allows the cells to get some energy, so we're going to look at that now. So aerobic respiration is with oxygen, and that's the process that we had just talked about. Today we're talking about anaerobic respiration, and remember, when you put the prefix an in front of a word, it means not. So not aerobic, or not with oxygen, and that's what we're talking about. If no oxygen is present, then the cell is going to go ahead and go through that glycolysis process where the glucose molecule is broken in half, and then it's going to go into a process of fermentation. Fermentation is when energy is released from food, but there's no oxygen available. So there's 2 different kinds. The first kind is alcoholic fermentation. Our food and beverage industry takes great advantage of this process. So alcoholic fermentation is where yeast and other microbes are just small microscopic organisms, so yeast and some other microbes are in an anaerobic environment, so an environment where there's not oxygen, and they're going to very quickly break down massive amounts of glucose, and in that process, they're going to create alcohol and carbon dioxide. So when you're watching commercials, think about like the Super Bowl. and you're watching commercials, and they always have beer commercials on at the Super Bowl. And when they're pouring the beer into the glass, you see all of these bubbles rising up. Those bubbles are the carbon dioxide that are produced from this the fermentation process. As an additive, there's also alcohol. It does provide limited amounts of energy, but if you think about it, yeast and other small microorganisms are not going to need a lot of energy because they're so tiny anyway. So let's look at this. So here's our cycle. We're going to start out with our glucose molecule just like we did with glycolysis. It's going to go through that glycolysis step. The glucose is going to be broken in half, and we're going to get our ATP right up here. So we've made our intermediate molecule, and that molecule, if there was oxygen available and it was a eukaryotic cell, it would move into the mitochondria for the next step. However, because there's no oxygen available at this point, those pyruvates are going to get some of the electrons. So when glucose was broken down in glycolysis, the NAD plus molecule picked up 2 electrons, so it could use those to go to the electron transport chain. But now the electron transport chain either isn't there or it's not working. So instead, that NADH molecule is going to give its electrons back to the pyruvate, and in that process, it's going to change that pyruvate into alcohol, ethyl alcohol. And when that happens, 2 carbon dioxides are going to be released. Now that NAD plus, because it gave up the NADH gave up its electrons, so it's available to pick up 2 more. So it's going to go back, glucose is going to be split again, it's going to pick up those electrons, ATP is going to be made. So this whole cycle is going to continue as long as there's glucose available, and we're going to get 2 ATP for every glucose molecule. That's a big difference from what we saw before. We had said that with oxygen, it makes up to 38 ATP, and this process is just making 2. But remember, with this one, we're talking about small microorganisms. They don't need a lot of energy, so that's enough to sustain them. The other kind of fermentation is lactic acid fermentation, and this is actually what happens in your bodies. So in this process, glucose turns into lactic acid. This is what happens during exercising. So muscles are running out of oxygen. Your muscles are burning through glucose faster than what your body can supply the oxygen to follow through with that process. So instead, it's going to revert into lactic acid fermentation, and it's going to produce it's going to produce ATP, and it's also going to make lactic acid. That lactic acid is what makes your muscles burn after you've done an intense workout. So again, it produces very little amounts of energy. It's not enough to sustain the organisms for long periods of time, but it is enough to get that organism through until more oxygen can be supplied to that area. So So here we have lactic acid fermentation. We have our glucose molecule. It's going to be split in half again, going to go through the glycolysis process. NAD plus is going to pick up 2 electrons, which allows this to turn into pyruvate. 2 ATP are going to be released again. This time, instead of making alcohol, the pyruvate is going to get its electrons back from the NADH. It's going to give its electrons back, so it's available to go pick up more from the next glucose molecule, and this time it's going to turn it into lactate. So what's happening here is your muscles, let's think about a long-distance runner. Long-distance runners burn through their glucose supply relatively quickly, definitely before they're finished with their long run. So their muscles are burning through this glucose faster than they can breathe to supply those oxygen to those muscle cells. So it's got a little bit of both going on. It's got lactic acid fermentation, and it still has the aerobic cellular respiration process occurring, but it's a little bit of both. The purpose of this is that while there's no oxygen available, it's still giving that muscle cell a little bit of oxygen or a little bit of energy. It's definitely not the same as the aerobic respiration where we make 36 to 38. Again, we're only making 2 ATP for every glucose molecule if oxygen's not available, and we're producing lactate instead, but it's better than nothing. So that is cellular respiration in a nutshell, definitely focusing on anaerobic respiration. I hope that that cleared up a little bit of confusion for you, and now that you're able to answer those questions, how are cell respiration and photosynthesis, how do they form a relationship, and how are aerobic and anaerobic cellular respiration different? If you have any questions, let me know in class.